Today, we'll be going inside a version 2 gearbox and learning the different parts and how they make your BBs fly. This video is brought to you by the AIRSOFT Reviewer 1 and evike.com. Warning: disassembly of any AEG or AEG gearbox should be done at your own risk. This video is for education purposes only. Before disassembling any AEG, you should make sure that the barrel is empty, the magazine is out, and the safety is turned on. Before starting, let's get a few basic tools and items to help us out when we're disassembling the gearbox. First, put a rag down so your grease from the gearbox doesn't get everywhere. Find some varying sizes of Phillips head and flathead screwdrivers, gear greases and lubricants, needle nose and regular pliers, and various Allen wrenches. Let's start by flipping the gearbox over so the right side is facing up and finding these screws highlighted in blue. Now let's start by taking out each individual screw. I like to start from the front and work to the back, but that's just a personal preference and you can choose any way that you like. Be careful and try not to strip the screws when you're taking them out. Once all the screws have been removed, it's time to separate the gearbox. To reduce the risk of flying parts, you can insert a small screwdriver into the hole marked by the blue arrow. Push in with the screwdriver and slightly lift the gearbox half, and then release the tension on the spring and pull off the rest of the gearbox. Before we start removing the internal components, first we must remove this spring highlighted in blue, connecting the tappet plate to the gearbox. This is done simply by using a pair of needle nose pliers, grasping the spring, and removing them from the peg on the gearbox. Now grab the spring guide and the cylinder and remove the entire upper assembly. The spring guide is the base of the spring. All of the pressure from the spring being dragged back is placed on this. Spring guides can be made out of plastic or metal, metal of course being better. On these spring guides we can see ball bearings. The bearing displaces the force evenly along the guide and are needed for heavier springs. Now let's look at the spring. This is the main power source for an AEG and determines its feet per second. Of course, compression also plays a role, but the spring is main. Now let's look at the tappet plate and the air nozzle. The air nozzle and the tappet plate are connected at the front, like this. When the sector gear rotates, the little silver nub you see in the video pulls back the tappet plate, which pulls back the air nozzle, which allows a BB to be loaded into the hop-up changer. Now let's look at the cylinder and the cylinder head. The cylinder is an empty cylinder which the piston moves through and air is compressed in. The cylinder head goes on the end of the cylinder and is where all of the compressed air in the piston is forced through by the piston head. Oftentimes AEGs lose velocity due to poor compression from the piston head and this part. Now for the piston and the piston head. The piston is what guides the piston head through the cylinder until it impacts the cylinder head. The teeth on the bottom of the piston are engaged by the sector gear and are used to pull back the piston. The rails on the sides of the piston are engaged by the rails on the sides of the gearbox to keep the piston on a straight path. The piston head is attached to the end of the piston and impacts the cylinder head. These also may have ball bearings as shown here. There are several different ways of having the piston head attached. This one is attached with a screw at the top of the piston head. Others may have a screw inside of the piston head, and these are easy. All you have to do is unscrew them. Once the screw is loose, just simply take apart the pieces. Others may have no visible screw, so you're going to have to take a piece of cloth, wrap it around the piston head, then tightly grip the piston head and screw it off of the piston. Now we'll move on to the gears. First, we can take out the sector gear, which is this one. If the bushing comes with it, just keep it there. Next, we'll take out the bevel gear. Now, the anti-reversal latch. And lastly, the spur gear. Now let's remove the bushings from the gearbox. Simply take them out with a flathead screwdriver or push them out from the other side. Bushings allow the gears to spin freely in the gearbox. Now that everything is out of the gearbox, I'm going to take a moment to clean it up and get all the original factory grease out of it. Be sure to do the other half too. Now let's replace the bushings, or if you have them, add new bushings. The bushings should fit tightly in the gearbox. You might have to push them in with your finger or the back of a screwdriver. Now let's talk about shims. Shims are little metal washers that you place in between the gear and the bushing to raise or lower it. Adding too many shims can lock up your gears, while too little can make them loose and break teeth. You have to find an equilibrium in between. Once you think your shimming is okay, place the empty gearbox cover over just the gears. Hold it tight and spin the gears inside with your finger. If they move loosely, then you've probably done a good job with your gears. Before we put the gears back in, let's oil up the spur gear. Then put in the bevel gear and the sector gear and spin them to make sure they're okay. Now, oil up the cylinder head around the O-rings. Force it in to the end of the cylinder and make sure this part right here is flush with the cylinder. Now to assemble the top part of the gearbox. Put the piston assembly into the cylinder assembly, the air nozzle onto the cylinder head, clamp the tappet plate onto the air nozzle, and place all of it into the gearbox. Don't forget to oil up the rails on the gearbox. Now attach the spring from the tappet plate back onto the gearbox. Put the irregular end of a spring into the spring guide and slide it into the piston. Now we're ready to put it all back together. Make sure everything is okay and in its place. Take a screwdriver and push the spring guide into the gearbox. Be holding down the cylinder while you're doing this so it doesn't fly out. There's a little notch in the gearbox that the spring guide fits into.